Okay, we have one general question,
Okay.
Bailin. Then we have some specific questions, but I'm going to get to the general one first.
Okay.
Let's see here. Okay, so the question was related to the availability of CO2
Yes.
in aquarium, and the question was, why do you need to dose CO2 in a home aquarium?
So CO2, and this is something that I like to emphasize a lot in terms of just basic plant horticulture, right? Your plants require what they call the three essential nutrients. A lot of times people talk about in terrestrial plants like your gardens, outdoor gardens, it requires nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the main building blocks of plant growth. But what people fail to emphasize a lot of times is that carbon dioxide is easily accessible for your plants outdoors. In the aquarium, even in ponds, you can a lot of aquatic plants can get CO2 at the surface of the pond or lake. The natural saturation of CO2 going in and out of the water is pretty rapid. So plants can, if the plants are the tips of the plants are up near the surface, it can get a fairly readily available source of CO2. But in our aquariums, because of the limited surface area, CO2 exchange is very limited. If you have enough light and you have all the other nutrients, but you lack CO2, your plants are not going to grow very well. They are just not going to have the same kind of health that you normally would see if you added CO2. And this is especially if you look at the molecular structure of cellulose, which comprises your aquatic plants. Carbon is a huge proportion of the aquatic plants in terms of their cellular structure. If I'm trying to remember what it was, it's greater than, I think it's greater than 70% of the elemental composition of the plant. So if you don't have that, the plants can't really grow. And if you're adding a lot of nutrients on top of that, that excess nutrients not getting utilized by the plants because it doesn't have the carbon to go in and form the building blocks. So that in turn allows algae to kind of take hold. That algae doesn't need carbon dioxide as much or carbon as much. It can utilize the other nutrients quite much more readily than an aquatic plant can. So I hope hopefully that answers the question.
Good. We have one more. This was a very specific question. So, and this doesn't make sense to you. I'm going to ask Brad Crow to actually ask the question differently. It says software exists that predicts human eye focal points for static images. Okay, it can be accessed via a plugin through Adobe. Is there any interest in testing your intended focal points to see what the software predicts and whether it matches up with your design intentions?
Well, I think that would be a really interesting experiment to do, right? Because a lot of times I will create something based on what I consider as a primary focal point, but it'd be really interesting to see whether that matches up with what I'm trying to create or what other aquascapers are trying to create. I think that would actually be pretty fascinating, and especially for some of the aquascapers that these professional guys who really go all out, they really work to emphasize that point of contrast, point of focal point in how they design their aquascapes. So you're talking about sometimes thousands of dollars for their prize money when they're competing. So that to them would be really interesting.
You know, the first thing that struck me as somebody who is a complete novice at all this, trying to deal with, you know, I mean, I like to have a beautiful scape, right? But, you know, plants are hard. And what really struck me was you had a couple of scapes that were hardscapes, right? Where there may be very few plants, right?
Yep.
I mean, so my experience is that you put a few plants in, they look good for about 3 weeks, and then by week 4, they're covered with algae, All right. How do you manage this balance where I can understanding a Dutch aquarium where there's so many plants, right?
Right.
But what do you do in the reverse situation where you have a hardscape and just a few plants? And how do you manage the to control the algae?
So for those kinds of aquascapes, a lot of it comes down to choosing the right kind of aquatic plants. One of the things that the Iwagumi style aquascape utilizes very what I would consider difficult plants, and it's designed so that you have to really be on top of the water changes, really on top of the nutrient loads. So what I tend to tell people is if you have an aquascape and you're looking for something that's easy, um, choose something like a stem plant, something that you know grows well. Um, it it almost acts like a nutrient sponge. So that's part of that. The other aspect is that with any kind of aquascape, with a plant aquascape, you you want to maintain the maintenance on it very careful, especially when you're first starting out the tank. In the first, what I consider the first week after you set up first couple of weeks after you set up a planet tank, that's still kind of a break-in period, right? And sometimes that, depending on how you set it up with what kind of materials you use, that can last anywhere from your 4 weeks up to up to 3 months sometimes. Like I had the aquascape that I set up several years ago. It took me about, I would say, about 4 months for it to finally really settle down to a point where it was really easy maintenance. And I still deal with algae on a regular basis. I'm able to minimize what I have in there, and just by keeping up on the maintenance. A lot of times, a lot of people talk about resetting the water conditions. The weekly water changes of a 50% water change will basically take majority of the nutrients out of your water system, of your aquarium, and kind of reset those conditions. Now, there's a caveat to that though. If you end up doing a lot of water changes and the plants are not being fed, then they're also going to be much more prone to algae. So again, it goes back to the nutrient load, the nutrient balance, having the nitrogen, the phosphorus. Yeah, people always talk about having phosphorus as a bad thing, but the plants absolutely have to have it. And then your carbon, if you don't have carbon dioxide, then you definitely want to be feeding the plants nutrients in addition to what little carbon dioxide they get. If they're starved, the algae can actually outcompete those plants quite easily. They're just simpler organisms that don't require the same kind of energy input that a aquatic plant would. So by feeding the plants, doing regular water changes, giving it good light, good flow, those are kind of the keys, but also choosing the right kind of plants. Slow growing plants are great, but you really need to dial your lights down. You really need to be on top of your water conditions. If used, and when I set up what I consider a low tech tank where I'm not using any CO2, I always have some kind of stem plant in it because I know that acts as a nutrient sponge. And then I still dose. I still do regular dosing twice a week. And that just ensures that the plants are still being fed, but that you have a way to really soak up any excess nutrients if it becomes a problem.
So the nutrients, you're talking about nutrients in the water column versus nutrients in the substrate,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And,
So there's different ways you can do it though. So recently there has been a new paradigm in terms of certain types of plants, certain types of stem plants that actually do better with leaner nutrient in the water column, but richer substrates. So like if you have a gravel base using a very complete, like a complete root tab that has all the nutrients and putting it down at the base of the plants actually do better. They produce better, they're better health. They have better health, they grow better, they're more robust, they have better color. And so it kind of all kind of works toward that. It's the nutrient needs that the plants really have to have that people kind of tend to forget about when they're doing a plant tank. It's like our gardens outside. When I'm out gardening outdoors once a month, I'll go out there and I'll feed my plants. You stick on the Miracle Grow spray and you feed the plants. Kind of the same thing with our aquatic plants. You still need to feed them weekly or as much as they need it. And you can usually tell the plants, they'll show you whether they're happy or not. They start getting chlorotic in the tips. They start, the tips of the leaves start getting really small. And so you kind of have an idea that the plants aren't happy, that they need the nutrients and they need the feeding.
Okay, anyone else? I don't want to monopolize the questions here.
See, there's a question about hard brown algae on the glass and stones. I utilize a algae crew that I keep in almost every single one of my plant tanks. In the larger tanks, I will get at least 2 or 3 bristlenose plecos, dwarf bristlenose plecos. These guys are great at basically taking care of the green dust algae that's on the glass. They will go after the brown algae. They will also go after other types of other, like more of the hard algae that coat surfaces. For the brown algae, if it's hard, trying to think about what that, I mean, the algae that I know of is more of it coats things, and it's usually at the beginning of an aquascape that you put together. That's what they commonly refer to as a diatom algae. Otocinclus love that stuff, and they will basically clean out a tank in a couple days if you put enough of them in there. It's usually a syndrome of a new aquarium. When I set up a new aquarium, I always have that as part of my algae crew. Now, there's also other types of algae that you get that are not as easily controlled, and that's where I utilize more something like a monos Gara. The Garas are also very, very good. They will end up picking off different types of hair algae, black brush algae. But the key to that is that you hit the algae with a little bit of peroxide, dose a certain amount of the peroxide and just kind of dose it right on top. It ends up killing and breaking down the algae, softening them a little bit so that the Amano shrimp or the Gara and some like your Chinese algae eaters, some of those guys will actually take care of that. Not Chinese algae, Siamese algae eaters. Avoid Chinese algae eaters.
So Bailin, so just a really, maybe this is just too dumb a question, but is a shallow tank better or a deeper tank better if you're starting?
A deeper tank as in tall or?
Yeah, tall, sorry, yeah, tall.
Oh, start with the shallow tank by far.
Okay.
So the problem with a tall tank, a lot of times the lights are, they're not really well built unless they're super, super high powered. And then what you end up getting is this gradient of algae going from the top down. At the bottom, you don't have much of the algae, but near the top where the light's most intense, you end up getting different types of algae just because it's just too much in there.
Okay. One person rather chatted the question, which is it okay to get large river rocks from a local stream?
Oh, I have. I mean, I've gone. It depends on the regulations in your state. Be kind of careful about that. But I have gone to when I was younger. I went to streams and stuff and used to collect rocks. What you want to do with hardscape material, try to maintain something that looks the same, maybe a little bit different color, but has the same texture. Same appearance, so that when you put it in the aquascape, there's actually it actually works in unison with each other. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of contrasting shapes and colors, and it'll take away from your aquascape itself. And yes, someone mentioned neorites. Neorites are absolutely wonderful snails. So light duration can work for algae control. The key to that is that you want to maintain enough light for the plants that they're going to photosynthesize. So I know that people talk about doing a blackout for certain things. You can do that, and that'll get rid of the algae, but it's only a temporary fix because you're still not looking at the underlying problems that are coming from the tank that are causing the algae. That'll take care of it. It will wipe the algae out, but then you'll see over time that it starts coming back. But it's a good way to get a reset on your conditions a lot of times, so that you can kind of figure out and change things here and there to make sure that you know what's causing the algae. And a lot of times it comes back to some of you guys may know Tom Barr. He's been in the industry and been in the hobby for years for plants, and he always comes back to the same thing. It's not having enough CO2 and not dosing enough to balance those two aspects out. Cyano. So cyanobacteria, cyano is it's a symbiotic organism that is both a bacteria and algae. And really, I would consider it more of an algae. Bacteria than I would an algae. So the key with that is that cyano can fix nitrogen from the environment. It fixes nitrogen to actually start growing. And so if you have low nitrogen levels in your tank and it's pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere or from your water before the plants can get to them, it is basically outstripping your plants by a tremendous rate. And so you've seen it where you go in the tank, you clean it out one night, you come up the next morning and the tank is again filled with it. It's basically taking all that nitrogen from the atmosphere, from any little bit in the water, and is basically growing at an extremely rapid rate. So a lot of people misconstrue that to do that, then you need to clean your tank and really drop your nutrients. What I've actually found does work is actually increasing your nitrates. If you can dose those separately, you increase the amount of nitrates in your tank so that the plants are happier, but keep your phosphates level. So you kind of have to have a separate bottle or a separate container of nitrates that you can dose in to basically feed your plants. Obviously, there's other ways that you can get rid of it. Erythromycin is the medication of choice, but it's not something that I really like to do because it still doesn't really get rid of what the problem is. And any little bit of cyano is usually enough for it to just take off again. What I've also started doing, and it does work while you're trying to get these things under control, cyano hates peroxide. I'll turn the filter off. I'll go in there with a little pipette of peroxide and just squirt it right over it. And you can see that stuff start to react almost immediately. And you can see parts of it start to melt. And it's really, really interesting. You see that stuff, it starts to break off from if it's covering a surface, it'll actually break off from the surface of the material that it's covering and float to the top. And you can just kind of scoop it out at that point. It's kind of interesting how that works, but low nitrogen is usually the big symptom of when cyano comes in. So there's a question about techniques of making aquascapes resistant to fish. So I do a lot of gluing of plants, like ferns and stuff like things like that. What I used to keep earth eaters, a lot of the species that dig, and what I've what I found was basically just gluing this stuff to like a piece of lava or something like that, that's dense enough that they can't dig it up and move it around. Since that time, I've seen friends of mine who have fish that can actually pick up the rock and move it from one side of their tank to another. So the best thing to do is just a lot of times I'll get something glued on and I'll just put some other stones on top of it and just try to hold it down. It's tough. The problem with the digging fish is that they're also very, very determined to move this stuff around to suit their conditions. But doing that, planting in pots is another way I've heard people do it. But the part of that is that sometimes they'll actually tip the pots over, which can make a mess in itself. So I actually, the next question is about rainwater in tanks. So my water conditions in my town is, at least in my neighborhood, is absolutely horrid. I use straight RO water, and then I reconstitute the RO water. And there's a couple reasons that I do that. Partly so that I can normalize the conditions of what I do each week during a water change. But the other aspect of it is I control the hardness and I can control the GH as well as the KH. Certain plants don't grow as well in really hard water, and some of them are a little bit more delicate. So, and some of the things that I like to grow, so I will reconstitute so that most of my my GH and KH, my GH is right around maybe about 3 to 4. My KH is right around 1 or 2. It's very, very low. It's almost considered soft, but it's great for growing some very, very delicate plants that don't like that hardness in order to grow. Okay, that's yeah. I mean, that might be interesting. Because I know a couple of people who really get a kick out of that.
Hey, no pressure, no pressure. If you want to, let me know. If not, no big deal.
Okay, sounds good.
So again, let the beginner plant guy ask the next stupid question here. So one of the things I've been trying to do is, and I should point out because I keep discus and angelfish, there's hardly any. I have one tank that actually has substrate, okay? But that's not because I like ugly tanks, it's because that's what I need to do to keep them clean. But I try to get in branches and so forth, and with the idea that I can glue plants on. Now I'm sitting here and listening to you about nutrients, about having a dosage to dose the water column and adding CO2, and I'm thinking, is this a real thing that I'm trying to do, or is it just somebody's fantastic idea that you can actually have a scape in which the plants are growing on branches?
So you can, like, I had I set up a tank, wow, this is over 10 years ago, that was, it wasn't quite as large a tank. It was a 40-gallon breeder that had a big piece of wood. And it was basically, I had different types of Java fern and different types of Nubius glued on it. And I was using CO2, and originally wasn't dosing very heavy, but I was also breeding different West African cichlids at the time. And the piece of Mapani was easily big enough to cover the entire bottom portion of the aquarium. That tank basically was my easiest tank in terms of self-sustaining population of the cichlids and also the plants. It was a weekly water change, dump some nutrients in, and basically let it go. I was pulling plants out of that tank on a weekly basis to bring to the aquarium stores, to the point where they couldn't take anything else because the plant was outstripping what they could sell. And that was in a small 40-gallon breeder. You can certainly do it. For instance, for your discus tank, using big pots, if you want to maintain the clean bottom, use pots for your aquatic plants. For instance, big sword plants, discus really do real well. They love the height. They love being able to go in and out of the soil plants, and some of the soil plants can get huge. What the way I would approach it, instead of using just gravel, do a portion of aqua soil in the bottom, in the lower portion, like the bottom half of your pot. Plant your soil plants in there, and then cover it with gravel. Now the aqua soil itself, that's going to provide a lot of nutrients for the soil plants, and they should thrive. And it's also going to be an easy way for you to basically nutrient like the dose tabs, the nutrient tabs, to be able to feed your plants. You can also do that with the pots of different types of stem plants. But if you really want to create something where you're creating a beautiful large aquascape for a discus or larger fish, that can be done. And I know if you go online and look at George Farmer, he is he's a UK aquascaper out of England. He has an aquascape that he's keeping some beautiful discus in, and it's fully planted with fairly easy to maintain with aquatic plants. Your crypts, he's got different types of ferns and stuff like that, Anubias, but it looks stunning. It's a beautiful aquascape. So it can be done. It just takes a little bit of planning, and I'm always happy to help out and provide input. Now, water sprite's a great plant. I love it because it's a great nutrient sponge. It's also a great one to kind of tell you how healthy your plants are, how happy they are. It stunts if you don't feed them well, but it's also a great way to kind of clean out what's in if you have a lot of nutrient overload. It does a great way to kind of clean the water and give you better water quality.
Okay, cool. Everybody's just watching intently, but there's very few questions.
Let's see. Let's see if I can find his aquarium.
So the most interesting exposure I've had to plants was actually back when my friend Paul Garrity built a tank and decided to fill the bottom with garden soil.
Oh, yeah.
Paul, you want to tell us just a little bit about what happened afterwards?
Well, are you trying to put me on the spot here? All right. The plants grew like crazy. I put compost and everything in. I had about 6 inches of soil in a 42-inch deep tank, and everything just grew, just blew out of the water.
It's a really, the method that is described does grow plants extremely well.
Also grew a lot of algae.
That's the caveat. So one of the things, there's a method called mineralizing soil that basically takes your soil, your organic soil that you use for plants, and you break down the organics in it over a period of time. If you look for it, I can put the link on it, but what it does is it basically takes organics, breaks it down over a couple months, and the point where all that's left is basically your soil with the nutrients, and the organics are no longer there. That's going to cause some problems for your tank. So that's a method that was developed by he was a marine biologist out in Maryland. That was he had this love for basically doing this kind of stuff, and he wanted to figure out a way that he could do it cheap, instead of having to pay for the really expensive aqua soil. That was there was a point at time where the aqua soils are easily $100 a bag, and he wasn't willing to do that, and I don't really blame him. So he was able to develop this method, and it works extremely well. You basically get it broken down, put it in the tank, and you cap it, and then you plant the stuff. But because the organics have already been in organics and some of the other contributors to algae have already been broken down and taken out, you don't have that algae problem, or at least it's mitigated quite a bit. And it does work very, very well. I've tried it once. I just tinker in my tanks a lot, so I end up pulling a lot of the dirt and stuff out from under the gravel. And that's where your algae comes from, is when you're trying to mess with the tanks and mess with the plants. It creates a lot of mess and creates the algae.
So I asked the question before about the duration of lights, and
Yep.
you mentioned photosynthesis. What's the minimum number of hours for plant lights to be on to have photosynthesis take place without too much time to cause the
Right.
algae to come in?
So a lot of people will run upwards to about 12 hours, which I don't recommend. That's too much light. And then as far down as 6 hours. I run anywhere, I run between 9 to 10 hours, depending on the tank and whether it's a high tech or a low tech tank. High tech tanks, I tend to drop that light down a little bit to about 9 hours. I know that the photosynthetic period it's more than enough time for it to grow during that time. Anything beyond that, you start getting into different cycles of the photosynthesis, the plant photosynthesis, where instead of utilizing the carbon dioxide, utilizing the nutrients, it's trying to produce some other nutrients as well. And it changes its physiology at that point, which can lead to different types of algae. And especially if you have a lot of light, that's where some of the problems come from. And I also, with a lot of my tanks, I tend to buy dimmable lights. I don't like running my tanks at full blast on lights, partly because it's a lot of work. You're constantly having to tinker with it, trying to keep up with the nutrients. So I tend to run things a little slower. I like to increase moderate amount of CO2. I drop my lights to about between 60 to 70% intensity. And then I run for about 9 to 10 hours, depending on what kind of plants I have, how much growth I want, and then also whether I'm going to be able to come home in time to enjoy them. So I see if I can find one of my favorite all right, let me see if I can get this one to show up in you guys. So this was a tank that I saw down in Houston. This is by a group called Aquarium Design Group. Jeff and Mike Sinski own this company, and this was one of our submissions to one of the contests. One of the years of the contest, Jeff Sinski created this Aquascape. It's an absolutely stunning discus tank. They basically only used hardscape material, and then they utilized the solar plant, the Amazonicus, Echinodorus Amazonicus. And the conditions, when I went and saw these guys in Houston, there were, I think at the time, there were 3 pairs of discus spawning. They had multiple generations of babies in there, and it was just as beautiful as it was in this picture. And the guy told me, the designer said it was a super easy tank to maintain, because it just required a lot of water changes. Basically, the plants are well fed. You just use nutrient tabs in the base of at the base of the soil plants, and the plants just kept growing, and go and prune them every so often, feed the discus, and they were just happy.
Okay, that's worth trying. And in general, so again, my questions are going to be rather specific. What kind of plants will handle sort of the higher temperatures that you need for the South Americans? in that 82, 84 degree.
Yeah, so I get asked that question a lot.
Uh-huh.
So we whenever our club is we participate in the GCCAs, their swaps a lot of times. The question I get asked that because a lot of people want to keep discus and they want to be able to grow plants. Really, the only plants that really handle that kind of temperature extremely well are some of the sword plants. There's a pennywort, Hydrocotyle leucocephala.
Okay.
That one will also handle that. It's indigenous to the U.S. As well as South America, and it can handle really high temperatures. Some of the Anubias will do okay. They can do okay in 82, but as they start approaching the higher temperatures, 84, 86, you can start seeing them kind of suffer. The plants start to do a little melting at that point. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful in terms of when you get into the higher temperatures.
Bailin, get some water.
I'm sorry?
Drink some water.
Yeah.
If I was your program chair, I'd be giving you water.
Well, I've had a cold. I told Willie I've been sick, so it's been a little rough.
Okay, well, thank you for your very useful talk. It was really good.
I'm glad. I'm very, very glad.
Yeah. Are there any more questions here? Okay. Some of you are clearly shy. Well, so Bailin, on behalf of the club, thank you very much. I certainly learned a lot about discus plants, so that's great. And I know Paul is thinking because I can see it in his eyes. Okay, because how to mineralize his garden soil.
Oh, I'm happy to answer any other questions you guys want. Reach out to me. I'm always available online, and this is what I love doing. So I love interacting with people.
And we are really hoping that when we do our show in March, that we can work something out with Bailin, because this is such a fast growing portion of the hobby. Yep. Right. And yes. Also it's like mostly young people, and we need some of those to really sort of flatten out our age curves here. Okay. And and those are the people that's going to be the future of the hobby. So I hope we can work together in the future. Okay, Bailin?
Sounds great.
All right, terrific. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in a month. Okay.
Bye.
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 Bye.